High five, high five. Go for it, go for it.
Oh, high five. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So the talk, you'll see, has like an asterisk next to the J there because it's a bit of a misnomer. We are going to talk about how JavaScript, the language, is standardized, but also we're going to talk a little bit about the reasons why, the policy and the kind of the business reasons that we do standardization in the way that we do. So it's actually kind of like a little mini lecture in disguise. So if you'll pull out your textbooks to page 172, I'm just kidding, got my teacher blazer on, so I thought I'd try that. So at this point, a lot of you are probably already aware that there's a group that works on standardizing JavaScript, the language, and that is a committee of people called TC39, and I'm really bad about throwing a lot of acronyms and stuff, so I put those down there, so TC39. In fact, their next meeting starts tomorrow, so you can follow along with the group's activities on GitHub or on Twitter. So I guess raise your hands if you were aware that there's a group called TC39. Yeah, it's a kind of a trod subject at this point. If you are already aware of that, then you might also know that TC39 operates in a proposal process through which they take ideas and kind of craft proposals around them. They get vetted, they get tested, there's documentation. It's kind of this long 4-stage process which might eventually result in that idea becoming part of the standard. And that's something that you can follow along with as well in the proposals repository. Click, there we go. So if you know that, then hopefully you know, or I really hope you know, that you can also submit proposals. Anybody can submit a proposal. You can comment. You can weigh in on the issues. You can contribute tests. You can add your own use cases or otherwise provide feedback. That's provided, of course, that you mind our code of conduct. I want to take a minute and point out our awesome new website, which is tc39.es, which, thanks to the Mozilla team, actually put in a lot of hours on that. And you can check out these other awesome repositories as well that kind of describes this proposal process in more detail. Click. So you know those things. Then you might also know that there are lots and lots of other web standards, many of which we've been talking about today. There's other specs, APIs, those sorts of things that are driven by similar working groups and committees at other organizations like the W3C or WhatWG, ECMA, at IETF. There's probably hundreds and hundreds of communities related to the web and internet technologies, and they're all working to develop a specification of some kind, ideally into a standard. So if you know all of those things, then congratulations, because knowing is half the battle. But if you want to learn more about TC39 specifically, then there are already some great talks online by my colleagues on the committee, Dan Ehrenberg, Miles, Yulia, and the whole host of people on the panel that really get into examples of specific features that were taken through the process, and also generally how the process with TC39 works. But TC39 is just one of many working groups, as we pointed out, and they work in a kind of similar fashion to a number of other working groups. So the next question that you might be asking yourself is, if TC39 proceeds in this way, well, like, why is it? Why do we do business this way? Because the processes, they are kind of complex, and they're kind of hard to discover, and they're kind of opaque. It took me a really long time to internalize all of this stuff, because it's just a lot. So the next question I started asking was, why is it done this way, and what even does it matter? Because on the surface, the proceedings of a standards developing committee look a lot like sort of your routine open source development practices, if not perhaps a bit more procedural and a bit more pedantic. In both cases, you have ongoing maintenance of some kind. There's a feature, a proposal process maybe, decision-making about that proposal. There's ideally tests and documentation that go along with it. And of course, everyone always agrees and there's never any conflict. It's a joke. One key difference, of course, is that in open source, we're working on a code base usually, and in standards development, we're trying to define behavior and algorithms for the people that will implement the standard. If you continue to look even closer at the process, you start to run into other immediate and important differences about the development process. So why are there members? Why are there delegates? Why are there invited experts and editors? Why do I have to sign a CLA or a patent on a cert or some other paperwork? Why do I have to join a committee? Why does this process take so long? Why is the process so different between different organizations? These are all really great questions that highlight some key differences between standards development and open source. And the answers I don't think are obvious at all. And I think anecdotally they also contribute to a lot of frustration that developers have with the platform. So if you've heard about all of these different whats, you know about the W3Cs and the WHATWIGs and the ECMAs and all that. Today I want to talk about why. So where do these processes actually come from? What are they being used for? And why are they important in the first place? If that happens to be subject matter that interests you, these are some of my favorite books and resources on that topic. I also made a TLA cheat sheet because there are lots of 3-letter acronyms and standards, and that can be hard to follow, so feel free to open that up and follow along. Let's do a really lightning quick recap, though, of the history of standards making. So, the first standards we ever made actually had to do with power and money. I mean, it's a business enterprise, right? This is in the Middle Ages. European monarchs were taking it as a matter of royal prerogative to start standardizing weights and measures so that they could, levy taxes. So if they're collecting like 6 bushels of wheat, it's the same 6 bushels each time, for example. They think that this word might have been derived from the idea of the king having a standard bearer, somebody who would come around with like their staff thing with like a picture of a lion or something. And so at this point, we kind of can think of a standard as being the concept used to validate identification and transactions so that the transactions are the same and the person is who they say they are. That concept of standards specifying, verifying, and validating sticks around for a really, really long time, but it doesn't evolve very much until we get to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. That's when other applications of the concept of a standard really start to become apparent, because we get a lot of companies that are producing new goods and services, and they're mass producing goods. They're inventing new industries and markets. And so cutting a very long story short, with all of this proliferation of new products and things, the idea of the standard starts to include common infrastructure like rail systems and cable systems for communication, and also the idea of that being a shared platform on which lots of people are going to send and receive things. Also during the Industrial Revolution, we have the problem of a lot of mismatched infrastructure systems. And all of this explosion of new products begins to create a lot of chaos, especially in our growing cities. So you may have read books about this in college, like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. We've got like a lot of stuff happening, and it's unchecked. And that unchecked growth is causing a lot of problems for society, because we had incompatible products, absolutely no oversight, what's that, and no objective safety checks. So again, that's where we had lots of loss of life from fires and like I've mentioned, The Jungle is a great example. So it became a government and a business imperative to fix these issues and fix these systems, but we all know that they did, and it was fine, and there was no problem, right? No. They didn't solve it. Of course not. Who did? Who stepped up? It was the engineers. Engineers started to collaborate with each other and form these professional organizations, some of which are still around today, like the ITU and IEEE, for example. These organizations provided a place where technical decisions could be vetted, debated, and then implemented And to get all of that work done, what they did was host things like technical congresses, which are kind of like the precursor to like TPAC today. They did debates, letter writing campaigns. They even had like meetups. They call them salons, but meetups, you know. That's what I'm going to start calling my meetups salons. It'll be cooler. And remember, they were doing all of this in the 1860s. That's crazy to me. So the standard, the idea of a standard now includes, in addition to that currency and that validation, ideas about agreement and how we're making agreement, in addition to ideas about interoperability and IP and patent concerns, because these are all folks from different companies that are collaborating. 150 years later, we are still using the same organizational structures and methods for standardization, and we're standardizing a lot more stuff. There's a standard for practically everything, especially if it relates to safety or operations or something. There's a standard for the fabric on these chairs, on your office chairs at home, like everything. If you can think of it, there's probably a standard for it. And why do we need them? Why specifically might we need web technology standards? Because, you know, hopefully you infer from the little quick history bit, they have pretty significant social and political, technical, and economic implications for society and how we work. JavaScript and other web technologies have to be able to meet some pretty important and explicit needs. That standardization process that these guys invented so many hundreds of years ago at this point ensures that the technologies end up addressing those needs and provides some benefits as a result. So let's take a look at 3 examples of those. Government procurement is one. Sad face, I guess, a little bit. Like it or not, governments are pretty key buying segments in nearly every industry and in nearly every country. The unique nature and role of government means that they have a huge impact on how a lot of products and services are made, and software is absolutely not an exception. And so they do that in a couple of key ways. One, of course, is purchasing ICT products and services. The standardization process actually generates specification docs and references and that kind of thing that demonstrate conformance to a given government's request for proposal, RFP. They have to be able to demonstrate that the technology is going to conform to that in order to, you know, be used by the government. Second is support and compliance. So spec language can also make it quite a bit easier to ascertain whether if a technology is going to be in compliance with government RFP. And SDOs, Standards Developing Organizations, will often partner with training companies or even offer it themselves to certify technologies or vendors or products so that they can, they can say that they're compliant with the technology. As a fun fact, I actually used to work for a company that printed ISO 9000 training materials like way back in the day in college, and I was like, what is this? No one's ever going to use this. Yes, a lot of people use that. Wrong, Jory. All right. And then they publish their specs because government has a major impact on promoting effective competition. And so SDOs publish their specifications because they want people to implement and support them. The more implementations, the more successful the spec. And that means more adopters, that means more vendors, and that means more possible service providers and no lock-in. And we certainly don't like vendor lock-in. Second example, market development. So standards minimize the risk and costs associated with new technologies, which can, of course, create or enlarge existing markets and lead to fair competition. One way they do that, or one way you could do that, of course, is through import-export regulations. You might want to enter a new geographic market, and here standards help facilitate trade between countries because They provide some common approaches and compliance assurances. So we know that the standards that apply to the product in country A are in agreement, alignment with the standards that might be required in country B. Product interoperability, that's basically what this conference is about, right? Standards can help guarantee, not that they always do guarantee, but they can help guarantee a certain degree of interoperability or a minimum level of performance for products and services and processes and that sort of thing, and that is super key. And then lastly, market creation. So again, when we think about innovating new technologies, that standards process can help add credibility to the technology and help stabilize it and signal maturity that is ready to go into products. Last example, public policy. We've talked a little bit about this on stage today. In some cases, standards can inspire public policy and regulations. But in other cases, the policy ends up inspiring the standards making process. The distinction to remember between standards and regulations is that conformity with standards is voluntary, but regulations are often compulsory. That's why they're regulations. But that said, standards are often either fully or partially captured into regulations and made into law, because that simplifies and accelerates a lot of regulatory work, and thanks to the established best practices that may have been defined in the standards process. So we can look at standards and public policies like GDPR to see how technology and regulatory frameworks are emphasizing one another, how they're relating with one another. We can also see how standards orgs like the W3C and OASIS, for example, take on standards work specifically to address public policy concerns in areas such as privacy and security. That's a big one. Man, cool. So delivering on the needs of government procurement, on market development, on the needs of public policy, and of course reaping the benefits that we get from them is much easier said than done. To do that, standards developing organizations have to meet certain requirements in order for those standards to be accepted by other governments, accepted by other markets, etc. And what those requirements are, and ultimately will be, depend on the level of standardization that's actually required and what kind of organization the group is. Because as we pointed out, there's a lot of them. So what kinds are there? There we go. So we really look at two different kinds that we're going to interact with more as people in the industry. The first is national standards bodies, which are usually they're public in that they can be government-sanctioned organizations, or they could also be private organizations or a combination of them that issue country-specific standards. And so you see a lot of these, and where these impact us most are in Asian countries. They collaborate with the international and the regional standards development organizations and representatives of their countries to get a standard incorporated in services. The second group is industry standards bodies, and those are the ones that I was talking about earlier with W3C and WhatWG and IETF. Those are primarily established by industry groups that want to coordinate their efforts on specific subjects, or they may have been created by a national standards body in order to coordinate standardization efforts on particular subjects like security, for example. Or in the case of IETF as another example, a gathering of independent professionals who promote best practices and standards innovation in specific areas. So just to kind of reiterate the connection here, ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, is the USA's national standards body, but it's actually comprised of members from these industry groups of which I think W3C belongs, but I know OASIS and some other, and ECMA is an industry group that reports to the Swiss National Standards Body. That's not confusing at all. If an industry body wants its standard to be accepted by a national body, so become a government standard, it needs to meet the rules and regulations of that organization. And if it further wants that standard to become an international standard, which JavaScript and HTML currently are, they have to play the final bosses. And the final bosses are the international standards bodies. ISO, IEC, and ITU are the final ones, the big guys. They place, of course, the most stringent participation and membership requirements on the standards bodies that feed work into them. And that's done through different processes, such as the pass submitter process, or a category liaisonship, which is also obscure and weird. But failing to meet the requirements of those processes will end up jeopardizing the work, which may be intended to become a standard, an international standard. And I don't know about y'all, but I think it's really, really important that our web technologies are and remain international standards, because that makes them truly, truly accessible to everybody everywhere. To develop them, the standards need to meet, the standards orgs need to meet certain requirements, and they have some processes and policies at their disposal, such as governance, review process periods, and IPR. Those will vary between organizations, but given what's at stake, they generally need to be really robust, really resilient, verifiable, and definitely repeatable. Governance is one such area where there are requirements that standards bodies have to ensure, and that means rules about how people can participate, who can participate, and that factors into the growing concerns that global policymakers have about the provenance of standards, like where did this work come from? Also, they're very concerned about the equitability of participation. Is one company sort of branch stacking a standard to get it pushed through for their own, for their outsized benefit? And how fair is the process in promoting fair business competition? Click. So if the governance is the who and the how, IPR is the what. So members who contribute work to an organization at some point have to make a commitment to license those contributions in some way. And our standards bodies have different policies here, and sometimes that can affect where our work ends up, whether we take something into the W3C, for example, or to a different organization. For an international standard, they definitely need to know the provenance of all the materials that went into a standard. They need to know what the terms of those materials, what terms they were contributed under, so we don't accidentally expose people to costly litigation or the risk of like a submarine patent or something like that. And that allows the standards org to provide access to X standard under Y terms. We obviously prefer royalty-free patent regimes in our community. I hardcore prefer that, but there's also a lot of standards in telecom that are under RAND. And that's very critical to make sure that it's very, very clear what the rules are, because it really affects the economic function of an area. So the last example that we have are review periods. SDOs often have different kinds of calls for review depending on what stage the standards process is in. They might have a patent review period where members can go and say, okay, yes, this doesn't, I do agree to contribute our work under these terms, and I didn't accidentally put something in I didn't mean to, that kind of thing. You can have a member review period, which might be the time when a working group is considered done with their work, but they want the broader body of the organization to have a chance to take a look at it. They have public review periods, which might make the spec available to the broader public or like a watchdog group or something like that to have a chance to weigh in. The W3C has a horizontal review period and a review process which looks at different issues like accessibility and internationalization. And people are able to, during this time, raise objections during the review period, and in most cases those objections have to be addressed before the spec can move forward in the process and finish its standardization process. It's a lot of different things to bear in mind when you're making a standard, and I think we really need them. We need the policies and we need the oversight in order to provide checks and balances as we go about making standards, and more importantly to me, obviously, web standards. It all adds up to a pretty high degree of scrutiny that we're putting on these processes, which the staff, the governing bodies of the SDO are all responsible for overseeing, but really all of us are responsible for the process. We own the process of making web standards. It belongs to us, so we need to be mindful of it. Standardization is pretty critical in helping us keep the downstream implications of how we're making decisions part of our conversations. So we can protect access to people so that everybody in the world is able to leverage our work and create new opportunities. This work doesn't just affect us. It affects all industries. It affects everybody. It affects people everywhere. It's critically, critically important. So I'm going to end today with a call to action for each of you to get involved with this process, the process of standardization. What can you do? You can join a standards developing organization like the W3C or ECMO or WhatWG or IETF or any group that's doing work that is interesting to you. Join it as a member or as an invited expert. If you are already a member, then respect the process. Don't weaponize it. If you don't agree with it, make it better because we own it. And it's really old, so it probably does need some updating, as I mentioned earlier. Look for ways to make it better and help that way. And of course, as always, mind the professional code of conduct in these groups, please and thank you.